Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where we begin our new series exploring the least remembered and most horrible events of the 1980s. For now, we will look at a few terrible things from 1980. Accidents, murders, and natural disasters were just a few of the more troubling events of this depressing year. Let's start with an entirely preventable plane crash. Polish Airlines Flight 007. Airplanes from communist countries were not necessarily known for their reliability and safety. The Ilyushin IL-62 was a commercial jet created by the Soviet Union. In 1972, Polish Airlines decided to buy some of these aircraft. Each one could hold up to 200 passengers, making it a very profitable plane. On March 13, 1980, one of the Soviet-made jets, Flight 007, took off from John F. Kennedy International Airport. Its final destination was Warsaw, Poland, with 87 people on board. Some of those on the plane were well known. Famous Polish singer Ananie Jantar was on board. So were 22 members of the United States amateur boxing team. The landing gear didn't deploy properly as the pilots attempted to land their aircraft. Air traffic control instructed them to abandon the landing attempt and fly away. As the pilots increased the throttle to the engines, it triggered a series of disasters. The engine on the left side of the fuselage exploded. It shot shrapnel in several directions. Some of the debris destroyed the other engine. Additional flying chunks of metal severed the electronics and hydraulics, which allowed the pilots to control the aircraft. The air traffic controllers watched in horror as the plane tilted to the right and plowed into the ground. It burst into flames, killing everyone on board. An investigation determined that a manufacturing defect in one of the turbines was responsible for the crash. Launchpad disaster. In addition to aircraft manufacturing defects, the Soviet Union had a problem with its space program. The Plesetsk Cosmodrome is a spaceport near the town of Mirny in Russia. Construction of the facility was completed on July 15, 1957. At first, it was used to launch ballistic missiles. But in 1963, they expanded the facility's mission. In addition to missiles, the spaceport needed to launch rockets. More importantly, the Cosmodrome was used to place satellites into orbit around the Earth. On March 18, 1980, a launch was scheduled. The rocket was supposed to put a military surveillance satellite into orbit, but the payload would never reach its destination. Several hours before the rocket engines ignited, the ground crew began filling the fuel tanks, first with kerosene, then liquid nitrogen and liquid oxygen, finally hydrogen peroxide. A few minutes later, at 7:01 p.m., 300 tons of rocket fuel exploded. 48 people died and another 38 were seriously injured. An official investigation determined that the ground crew was at fault. But the following year, the same accident almost happened again. Engineers discovered there was a flaw in the fuel filters used by the rocket. The Soviet government lied and told the public that the satellite launched as expected. Countries outside the Soviet Union were unaware of this disaster until 1989. Longest serving inmate. Long prison sentences aren't uncommon for those who commit murder, but only one prisoner can hold the world record. Paul Geidel was born in Hartford, Connecticut on April 1, 1894. His childhood was a series of traumatic events. Paul's father was an alcoholic who owned a saloon. He died in 1900 when Paul was just 5 years old. Paul's mother couldn't care for him, so he spent most of his formative years in orphanages. At 14, Paul dropped out of school and started working at hotels in New York City. He also attempted to increase his earnings by stealing. On July 26, 1911, when Paul was only 17, he attempted to rob a wealthy 73-year-old broker. He let himself into the man's room and then suffocated him to death with a rag soaked in chloroform. 2 days later, the police arrested Paul. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. After being found guilty, he was sent to Sing Sing prison. For the next 15 years, he behaved perfectly. Due to good behavior, Paul's sentence was reduced. In 1926, it looked like he might be released, but instead a doctor found he was legally insane. Paul transferred to the Dannemora State Hospital for the criminally insane. He remained there until 1972 when he was moved again to the Fishkill Correctional Facility. In August 1974, Paul was finally granted parole, but he was 80 years old and had spent 63 years in prison. He decided he wouldn't make it on the outside and chose to remain behind bars. On May 7, 1980, Paul, who was 86 years old, finally decided to leave prison. He had served 68 years and 296 days, earning a spot in the Guinness Book of World Records. He spent the rest of his days at a Beacon, New York nursing home. Paul passed away on May 1, 1987 at 93. Sumpul River Massacre. Central America was also a dangerous and violent place. El Salvador and Honduras share a border. Honduras is the larger country and has usually been more prosperous. Because of the economic inequality, refugees from El Salvador have periodically poured into Honduras to find better lives. This led to war in 1969. Once hostilities ended, the two countries agreed to establish a demilitarized zone, which extended more than a mile on each side of the border. Over the next decade, refugees began pouring into the town of Los Araras in the DMZ. Honduras was worried about refugees from El Salvador causing instability in their country. The government in El Salvador accused the refugees of training guerrilla forces. In March 1980, El Salvador instructed the refugees to leave the DMZ and return to their home country. When they didn't follow instructions, the army marched on Los Araras. The refugees fled across the river into Honduras. The leaders of El Salvador and Honduras then put aside their differences and devised a plan to eliminate the refugee problem. On May 13th, military forces from El Salvador began pushing into Los Araras. Refugees tried to flee across the river into Honduras, but on May 14th, soldiers from Honduras began attacking the refugees to force them back into El Salvador. The refugees started crossing the Sumpul River, hoping to return to El Salvador and stop the attacks. However, they weren't allowed to complete the journey. Soldiers from both sides began shooting at the refugees. Helicopters even arrived and started killing anyone who ran. Most of the children who survived the massacre drowned in the river. At least 300 died. Some estimates say that the body count was closer to 600. Several weeks after the massacre, villages along the river began experiencing outbreaks of typhus. The reason is that nobody bothered to retrieve and bury the bodies of the dead refugees, so the corpses polluted the river and spread disease. Both Honduras and El Salvador refused to admit wrongdoing. The United States also didn't acknowledge that anything had happened. However, the United Nations published a full report describing the incident on April 1, 1993. Night of the Twisters. Tornadoes are a common feature in the United States, but one event created an exceptionally deadly and rare event. On June 2, 1980, intense storms appeared over the upper Midwest. They created tornadoes that touched down in Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio. The storm continued overnight but would target a new set of victims the next day. In the early hours of June 3rd, the storm system deployed more tornadoes into Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Maryland, and Nebraska. The city of Grand Island soon became ground zero for the storm's wrath. A tornado touched down in the city a little after 2 a.m., but the storm system was slow-moving and remained stationary. Over the next 2 hours, 6 more tornadoes dropped from the sky into the city. By 4:30 a.m., Grand Island was devastated by 7 tornadoes. The twisters killed 5 people, injured 200, and caused $285 million in damages. That would be worth over $1 billion today. Debris from the storm was buried in a landfill known as Tornado Hill. It is a popular spot for bikers in the summer. In the winter, people ride their sleds down it. The Dingo Attack. In Australia, even children weren't safe in the 1980s. Lindy Chamberlain Creighton was born in New Zealand on March 4, 1948, and moved with her family to Tasmania in 1969. She married Michael Chamberlain on November 18th. 5 years later, the couple moved to Mount Isa. Lindy and Michael had 2 children during the 1970s, and both of them were boys, but Lindy always wanted a daughter. Her wish finally came true on June 11, 1980, when Azaria was born. On August 17th, a couple months after Azaria was born, Lindy and Michael decided to take their baby on a family camping trip. They went to Uluru, the site of a famous sandstone formation. When the couple awoke the following day, Azaria was gone. They reported the missing child to the police and told investigators that a dingo had taken the baby from their tent. They organized a search, but never found the baby. All that remained of the infant was bloody clothes. The Australian government didn't believe Lindy and Michael. Investigators decided that the couple must have killed their child. On October 29, 1982, Lindy was sentenced to life in prison. Michael received an 18-month suspended sentence. Lindy appealed her conviction, but the courts refused to reconsider the decision. Fortunately for her, a random discovery would soon clear her name. In early 1986, a British tourist visited Uluru. He fell to his death during a climb. It took 8 days for rescuers to find his body. When they found the dead tourist, it was clear that he had fallen near several dingo lairs. Not far from the corpse was a jacket that belonged to Azaria. Lindy and Michael were telling the truth. A dingo did kidnap and kill their baby. On September 15, 1988, the convictions were overturned. The couple was awarded $1.3 million for being wrongfully imprisoned 2 years later. The settlement did not provide financial security for the family. It only covered 1/3 of their legal fees. Whether it was due to plane crashes, exploding rockets, oppressive governments, or hungry animals, death was stalking everyone in 1980, and those who won the deadly lottery didn't live to tell the tale. What do you think about these horrible events? Did we miss anything that we should have included? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about this turbulent decade, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode in the series. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.